A colossal figure watching a family drive by in the middle of the night, a witch appearing in a scared man's room in the dark, and mysterious phantoms terrifying the children on a ranch. Today's episode is another one filled with an assortment of scary and allegedly true stories. Enjoy, and remember to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. I'd love to hear some especially believable cryptid encounters. Also, check out eeriecast.com to enjoy tons of terrifying podcasts like this one. Now, let's begin. The Wooded Void, from Abigail W. When I was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, I used to live in a type of trailer park, which was really only 6 different trailers spaced out on the hillside. One day I was sitting in my room playing PlayStation when my dad came in. "Hey buddy, why don't you go take my axe and see if you can chop down a tree?" he said. As a kid, my face lit up. I was super excited, but as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that he and my sister's mother only wanted any reason for me to be out of the house, so they could do adult things, if you catch my drift. Anyway, I did what he said. I grabbed his axe, then I walked outside, onto the path into the woods behind our trailer. Back then, I was probably singing some Eminem or 50 Cent song, swinging that axe around like I was in a video game. Once I made it down to the little clearing on the forest edge, I found the perfect tree that I myself could actually chop down. It was probably 8 feet tall and only 1.5 feet thick, but that's the one I wanted. I stood there, chopping away at this poor little tree. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling my name from inside the forest. "Abigail." I stopped. The voice was familiar. In fact, it sounded exactly like my school crush. "Ashley?" I said, peering into the woods. But I didn't see anyone. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued to chop away at the tree. "Come here, Abigail." It called out again. This time I was certain it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. This wasn't the first time in my then short life that I'd encountered something that I believed to be supernatural. So I stayed calm and pretended that I didn't hear anything at all. I just went on chopping until the tree finally came down. "Abigail, come play, Abigail." It spoke again, still sounding exactly like Ashley. Once again, I ignored the calls, picking up the tree and beginning to drag it back up the clearing to home. But once I got halfway up the hill, I could feel a million eyes staring at me. Against any sense of better judgment, I dropped the tree and turned around to look. And there she was, Ashley, standing where I just was not 10 seconds ago, waving at me with this ear-to-ear smile on her face. I closed my eyes and said, "You're not real, you're not real." But when I opened my eyes again, she was still standing there, staring at me. But to my dismay, her ominous grin turned into sadness, and the facade broke. In a voice guttural and deep, she said, "Come on, Abigail. Come play with us." After this, I for some reason picked the tree back up and ran as fast as humanly possible, never looking back until I made it to my house. Once there, I dropped the tree and grabbed my door handle. I stopped only for a second, calmly opening the door, not thinking that I was still out of breath from running. My dad asked me why I was breathing so hard, to which I replied that I was just excited about the tree. He went out to look, jokingly calling it a Paul Bunyan tree. I never went back into those woods until 10 years later, when my dad and I had moved back for a short period. I took a walk in those woods, never hearing or seeing anything weird. However, when I was walking back out, I swear I felt those eyes on me again, but I never did see anything. Just felt that feeling that something was definitely out there. It took until recently to figure out that maybe what I saw was a skinwalker, but I can't be sure. I just know that if it really wanted to get me, it definitely could have, and I'm lucky to be here to tell you my story. Farmer Ghost, from Ranch Girl. One morning, my brother and I were waiting on our school bus. Mind you, we lived in a ranch that my dad worked in. My mom had to drive a little over an hour into town to get to work from there, so we had to be up and ready for school before our parents left. Our bus usually came around 5 to 5:30 a.m., depending on which way the bus came into the ranch. Sometimes our bus driver didn't feel like getting off the bus just to unlock the gate, and would drive a few more miles to the main entrance because the gate there is usually opened. So our mornings were really dark, and the stars were usually still out. We did our usual morning routine, feeding the animals before the bus arrived. We then stood and waited at the end of our driveway. My brother was at one end and I was on the other. We noticed a lot of cows were out near the house. We saw a white calf drinking from its mom, who was the same color. Thinking nothing of it, I turned to my brother and whispered, "Do you see the bus?" He replied, "No, do you?" We proceeded to repeat these questions until at one point, when I turned to ask him again, I noticed he had a scared look on his face, and he was now looking past me. The first thing I thought of was that the mama cow doesn't like us being close to her baby, or maybe there's a bull behind me. I turned around slowly to see what my brother was staring at. I saw something that for the past 36 years I still think about. I can't even explain what I was looking at. We were just kids then. What I saw was a headless man milking the mama cow. Her baby stood nearby. The man was sitting on nothing, dressed in a checkered suit. He had what we'd call a carpet bag sitting beside him, and he wore a bow tie. Slowly, he looked towards us. I know what you're thinking. How do you know he was looking at you if he didn't have a head? Well, I was judging that by his shoulders, which were now angled towards us. I heard my brother running, and I followed fast behind him, leaving behind my books and sandals. We ran back to the house and hid in the washroom and the screened-in porch. We then heard someone in the house. Whoever it was wearing boots and spurs, it sounded like. We then decided to run towards the hunting camp that was directly behind our house because we knew someone didn't live too far from it. As we ran towards it, we saw hundreds of wild pigs. If you know anything about wild pigs, they can hurt you and even kill you. So we jumped onto the picnic tables holding onto each other. I was crying and horrified. I peeked out from under my brother's arms, and I saw that the pigs were all gone. I couldn't believe it. Were these ghost pigs? After all, they were there one second and gone the next. We jumped off the tables and headed for the house that we knew someone lived in. We banged on their door, screaming that we needed his help. He comes to the door with a gun. We explain what's going on, and he goes to our house and searches around for this headless ghost. He tells us he doesn't see anything out of the ordinary, that we're safe. As soon as he heads home, our bus finally shows up. I sit in the very back. Our bus drives by the mama cow, and I don't see anything weird there anymore. We told our parents about it when we got home, and they basically concluded it was all in our heads. For the years we lived there, I was scared to be left alone in the early mornings or at night. My dad finally decided to wait with us until our bus came by to pick us up from there on out. Guadalajara Witch, from Silver Bullet 54. Witches are ingrained in the culture of Mexico. My friend Thomas has an uncle who is convinced that witches are real. He relayed a story to me that his uncle told him about an experience he had in his younger days. Thomas is Mexican, and so is his uncle, and I was convinced this story is true. In 1988, Thomas's uncle was exploring the city of Guadalajara in western Mexico with some friends. They'd reached a large cathedral with twin gold spires when one of them spotted a strange mark on the ground. They all gathered around it, and Thomas's uncle said, "That's a pentagram." His friends figured it was a kid who didn't know any better or teens just playing a prank. His uncle agreed, but felt uneasy the entire day after seeing that. That night he was lying in bed when he suddenly saw this shadow cast over the wall. This shadow was tall and thin, and the head had a shape to it, as if it was wearing a pointed hat. He sat up, but as soon as he did, the shadow vanished. When he told his friends about it, they said it was just sleep paralysis, a hallucination. Even so, he figured that shadow was cast by something as real as him. He was so terrified, he slept in a motel for 3 nights straight, rather than the house of the friend he was staying with. The 5th day after this experience, he was talking to some locals about it, and one of them said, "See, that witch tried to spirit away my granddaughter once. Scared her off with some silver bullets and a cross. Haven't seen her since." He said that in such a solemn way, it didn't seem like a tall tale or rambling of someone who lost their mind. The other men all nodded too, and a young man said, "Did I hear Fernando mention a witch? Samuel and Ali saw her as well." His uncle figured that a corroboration like that held some weight. He decided he would not be scared by this witch. What happened the following night was a complete opposite effect. He and his friends went to the cathedral at about midnight, waiting for something to happen, although they weren't sure what exactly they were waiting for. It was slightly past 1 a.m. when they heard someone walking around and muttering. They all peeked from around a column and saw a wizened old woman. She was holding a weird book with a title in a foreign language that none of them could pronounce. She seemed to be waving her hand in a strange manner. In their eagerness to see more, one of them slipped and hit his knee on the ground. The woman's eyes snapped right over to them, and they all ran. They heard her chasing them, saying,
"My magic is my business. I shall curse you all. Curse you all."
They didn't know if she was serious or crazy, but they kept running until they reached a cantina. They looked back and saw the woman grinning and nodding. She pointed one crooked finger at all of them and mouthed,
"Stay away."
Was this woman a witch? Hard to say myself, but Thomas at his uncle is convinced that there is a witch in Guadalajara. Maybe she was psychotic. Either way, she was certainly dangerous. So I guess now Thomas and I no longer need to tell stories about the Pennsylvania witch of Ridley Creek. We have our own tale, the Witch of Guadalajara. The creepy neighbor across the street. From M. Jean Romeo. I moved into a new home early in 2020 with my eldest brother. The first few weeks were great. For context, my new home is an end terrace, so my house is right next to the entryway, with a long gravel path running along the left side of the house and snaking down the back of the row of houses. My street is relatively quiet, save for the noisy Irish matriarch that lives next door. It all started one weekday afternoon. I am fortunate enough that with my job I've been able to work from home. There is a small area that branches off my living room where I've set up a mini office. It works great, as it gives me a separate work area that's set apart from my living room. One day around 3 p.m., with a few more hours to go until I could finish my work for the day, I headed into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. A few minutes later, hot beverage in hand, I re-entered the living room. Just as I was about to turn the corner and head back to my desk, a strange feeling came over me. That feeling of being watched. I turned my head and looked at the large living room window that overlooked our street. I yelped and dropped my cup, because standing there, face pressed against the glass, trying to peer in through the gaps in the blinds, was an old man. I locked eyes with him. He smiled wide at me before moving back from the glass and out of sight. Unnerved at what just happened, I edged my way closer to the window and peeked through the blinds. He was now standing at the bottom of the drive, still staring, but no longer smiling. He was a skinny man, fairly tall and dressed in shabby clothing. He had wild white hair and dark, piercing eyes. As I got a good look at him, I heard an elderly woman's voice call him to get back inside. At the woman's voice, he slowly turned and walked across the street. The old woman shouted at him for going outside without her knowing, and she ushered him back inside. It was almost comical at that moment that this frail-looking woman, who was a good foot and a half shorter than him, was manhandling him back into the house. As the door closed behind them, I let out a breath and shook my head. That was creepy as heck, I thought, but I tried to push it to the back of my mind. I still had work to do, after all. I told myself it was just a harmless old man, a creepy old man spying on me, but harmless nonetheless. A few days passed. I hadn't mentioned the incident to my brother, as when he got home from his job, he would be tired and would retreat straight to his room, so I didn't want to bother him. Once again, it was a weekday afternoon. I'd called it a day early with work, having completed everything I needed to do that day, and was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through my phone. My back was to the window and the blinds were open. The house was silent, but then I started to hear a soft tapping noise directly behind me. I froze in my seat and listened as the tapping continued. I slowly sat up and turned to face the window. Lo and behold, my creepy elderly neighbor was back, peering through the blinds and tapping a skinny finger against the glass. I shrieked and shouted for my brother to come downstairs right now. My brother came barreling down the stairs, but of course, the man had once again moved away from the window and out of sight. My brother asked what was wrong, and I told him that I caught the neighbor staring at me through the window, and it wasn't the first time it has happened. He was angry and immediately went outside. He went across the street to knock on our neighbor's door. I watched him from the safety of our doorway as the couple's door opened and the frail-looking old woman answered. I watched as my brother hurled angry words at her, and she bowed her head in apology. As this was happening, the man suddenly appeared in front of our open doorway, clearly having come from the entryway, and startled me. I quickly shut the door in his face, frightened by the crazed look in his eyes. Those dark eyes. Moments later, I heard the bellow of my brother's voice just outside our front door. The door then opened and my brother came inside. He was breathing heavily, likely from all the shouting and having sprinted back across the street. He locked the door behind him and told me he told the man and old woman to stay the heck away from our house, or he'd be calling the police. Seeing the fear on my face, he patted my shoulder awkwardly, his way of comforting me. A few weeks passed by, and luckily there had been no more incidents. We had a rare day of sunshine, so I had decided to hang some of the laundry out on the washing line. It was about midday afternoon, and I was enjoying having some time outside in the garden. I leaned down to lift a bedsheet from the basket and proceeded to hang it on the line and peg it in place. As I turned back to grab the next item, my eyes caught movement to the left of me. Looking up, I was horrified to find myself eye to eye with the crazy old man from across the street. He was peering over what was easily a 6-foot fence from the entryway next to the house. I stared at him transfixed. I heard the scratching of fingernails on the wood of the fence, as if he was clawing at it in an attempt to get to me. I shook off my stupor, and with more bravery than I thought possible, I screamed at the man to get the heck away from me. He jumped slightly, surprised by the volume of my voice. His eyes squinted slightly, as if appraising me, and as quick as he had appeared, he slid out of sight. I stood there a few moments longer, and was relieved when I finally heard the crunch of gravel that meant he was walking away. I called the police after that, but as he hadn't done anything to me or my home, there wasn't much they could do. After that, we decided to get a gate installed at the bottom of our drive, with a lock, so he wouldn't be peering in the living room window anymore. I've also spoken to some of the other neighbors, who all have stories of their own of the creepy antics of this old man. Seems he has a habit of escaping the watchful eye of his wife to go prowling the street and surrounding neighborhood. Luckily, he has never done anything too bad, but his actions are creepy nonetheless. I caught wind of a neighbor's conversation the other day that his wife was looking to put him into a care home. No incident has happened since then, and I hope it stays that way. Sometimes I think the scariest thing in this world is some of the people that live in it. A Shadow in the Doorway. From Raquel, 1993. When I was 11 years old, I lived with my grandmother in a very old house in rural Washington state. My brother and I both lived with my grandmother in a house that's been in the family for a few generations. My great-grandma died in the house in the garage. This is important to the story, which has now been converted to a rec room type of area, with a pool table and some video games. My grandma only had 2 rooms in her house. One was her room and the other went to my brother, due to him being a teenager. So we put my bed in the rec room/garage, which I didn't mind at all. I thought it was pretty cool to have my own space and bed, since never before had I had anything like that before. There were woods surrounding my grandma's house, and to get to her place you had to drive 10 minutes up a dirt road. We would often hear coyotes and cougars at night. I loved living in the woods. I spent a lot of time playing outside. I lived with my grandma for about a year before I noticed that sometimes weird things would happen. One day I got off the school bus and found I was home alone, so I went to watch some TV to pass the time. When I got into the living room, I had this terrible feeling, like almost sick to my stomach from dread. I began to get really scared, and thankfully, my brother got home, and I still felt that feeling, but at least I felt safer having someone else with me. The rest of the night was normal, until I was getting ready for bed. I heard this strange noise outside the garage door, almost like something with claws running around on the pavement outside. My bed was up against the garage door, so I could hear really easily out there. Whatever it was seemed to have huge claws. I assumed it was a cougar. I love animals, so naturally I wanted to see this cougar myself that was now outside the house. If you were to go out the front door of the house, there is a big wooden fence that surrounds the yard, and it does not include the outside of the garage. So I went out the front door and climbed up onto a tree so that I could see over the top of this fence. What I saw was the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was an elk of sorts. We don't have elk in my part of Washington, but I remember seeing it and immediately thinking, it's got to be an elk. At a closer glance, though, I realized this wasn't a normal elk. I could see all its ribs, and one of its legs had a bone sticking right out. When I looked down, expecting to see hooves, I saw claws, and they were big. That's what I'd been hearing walking around outside when I was in bed. About half of its body was missing hair, and it looked dead. But there it was moving around outside. But why was it so close to the house? I ran terrified to the front door, slamming the door shut behind me. I stayed in bed with my big brother for the rest of the night. The next day, I went to my aunt's, and I haven't spent another night at my grandma's since. Oddly enough, later on when my grandma died in 2015, I had that same dreadful feeling. I'm 27 now. This still haunts me to this very day. I'm very curious to find out what I saw. Midnight Ghosts from Klimchi 2020. I'm from Republic, Washington. When I was 9 or 10, I lived in a very rural community in Washington. I was homeschooled for most of my childhood and had a very close friendship with another homeschooled family who I met through some alternative schooling. There were 4 girls and 1 boy who mostly didn't like being surrounded by a bunch of girls. This family lived on a large piece of land, about 1/3 of a mile from the highway and over 1 mile from any neighbors. One summer night, when I was staying over, the 4 of us girls decided to stay outside in the tent. We did what most kids do, tell scary stories trying to freak each other out. Sometime around 10 p.m., we were getting ready to go to sleep when we saw lights and we heard a truck coming down the driveway. Being that it was summer, we didn't think much of it, since the family was heavily active in the community. We assumed a friend was just stopping by, but still being curious, we decided to see who it was. When we poked our heads out of the tent, there was no one there. Slightly unsettled, we rationalized it was probably a logging truck whose lights had hit our tent perfectly on its way by on the highway. We were just starting to feel comfortable again when we saw the lights and heard another truck. Immediately we looked out, but it was gone. Nothing was there. Thinking we had just freaked ourselves out with stories, we gave sleeping one more try. About 20 minutes later, the truck and lights were back. This time, terrified, we all lay perfectly still and listened. The truck, this time, stopped right outside of our tent. The truck door slammed open, then shut, and Boots walked up the steps, crossing the porch of the house, which was about 50 yards from the tent. At this point, we knew we weren't crazy, so once the sound stopped, we ran like heck back to the house and into the living room, where we stayed for the rest of the night. It's been years since this happened. I mostly chalked it up to my imagination, thinking that maybe I just dreamed it up. Until about 6 months ago. I was talking to my mom and she told me that the day after this happened, my friend's mom had called her and told her how scared we were in the morning. It freaks me out knowing this wasn't a dream. Astral Projection from Anonymous. I'm Native American, and I'm a part of Treaty 6. In our culture, when you sleep on your back, you leave your body open, and sometimes your spirit can accidentally go out. When this happens, you end up having an out-of-body experience, or astral projection. This only happened to me one other time when I was young, but it wasn't as creepy as this. I was home alone, just finishing up playing my Xbox, and I was ready to go to bed. I'm not entirely sure when I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, I was in the kitchen beside the door in the corner. For some odd reason, I also felt as if I was being watched. I then looked down at my hands, and my right hand was glowing. I got up and walked over to the window. There, I saw a hand pressed up against it. I stood there and slowly hovered my glowing hand up to the hand pressed up against the window. This other hand had tan hair and big fingers. But then I saw the face. I didn't really get any facial features, but I did lock eyes with it. Eyes that were solid black. When I started to scream, it ran and roared as it took off. I felt my body shiver, and I got goosebumps on my back and neck. Then I woke up for real. I was still terrified. Everything seemed to be spinning, and scarily enough, when I woke up, I could still hear the lingering sound of its roar. I thought I was just tripping out. I passed it off as a nightmare. It was 5 a.m. then, and I couldn't really get back to sleep, so I waited until morning, until it got a bit brighter. I thought to myself as I walked to the kitchen, it didn't happen. It was just a nightmare. I thought that until I stood there looking at the window. The blinds were open, and there was a huge handprint on the window. Immediately, I texted my friend group a picture, telling them what I saw last night. My friend asked me a specific question. What color was it? She's a spiritual person, and her family is very traditional, as they attend ceremonies quite often. I said that it was tan in color. Then she replied, "What the heck? My dad and my uncle saw that same Bigfoot when they were younger." I was left speechless. In our culture, Bigfoot is a spirit. That's why they could never find him on TV shows like Hunting Bigfoot. My grandma said he could shapeshift and things like that. That's the end to my terrifying tale. The Haunted Villa. From Nina W. It was summer vacation. My family decided to book a villa, as they do every year. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2009, and my grandmother had just passed away from cancer. She had breast cancer, and she'd been fighting this illness for 2 years. She was such a strong and inspiring woman. I can still remember her strength in mind and spirit and confidence, and that she would survive this illness. Unfortunately, she passed away, leaving our family broken and torn apart. A few months after her death, my family decided it would be a great idea to once again go on a family vacation. When my grandmother was still alive, we'd book a villa somewhere isolated and spend an entire week with the family together, drinking, eating, taking long hikes through nearby woods. It was always great to be spending time together, making the family bond strong. Only, after the death of Granny, our family members rarely talked. Mobile phones were not common at the time, and Granny usually brought us all together when we'd visit her at her apartment. My brother and I didn't want to go at the beginning. We didn't want to spend time with our nieces and nephews who had never tried to get in touch with us anymore. Our parents changed our minds when they decided that we could choose the villa. My brother and I eagerly accepted the offer, and so we roamed the internet for hours until we found the perfect destination. It was a large 5-story house with a large garden that had a small pond, a decent-sized swimming pool, and a small forest at the edge of the garden. This house was old, built in the mid-1930s, and renovated and modernized a few times over the years. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 huge bathrooms, a large modern kitchen, a wine cellar, which had a big lock on it so I could never seem to open it. Downstairs had a dining room which had a large piano and a living room, which overlooked the beautiful square in which the house was situated. In the attic was a large playroom, which had a ping-pong table, a few game consoles, and a large dollhouse. This dollhouse was so large a grown man could easily fit in it. To be honest, it was everything a 9-year-old child could wish for. We'd be staying in the house with 12 people. My 3 nieces, Jisoo, Lori, and Dahlia, my nephew Peyton, my brother Ezra, my 2 aunts Jane and Nicole, my 2 uncles Frank and Peter, my parents, and the 2 dogs. Kiara was a black Labrador belonging to Jane, who's very territorial and can be aggressive if provoked, otherwise a sweetheart to those she trusts. The other dog, Chico, is Nicole's. Chico is a small black Russian terrier who was easily spooked and almost always aggressive. He'd almost always bark or growl, but would bite you if you came close to him. My aunt Nicole had found him when he was a little pup in the forest near her house. He'd been beaten and left by his original owners. Nicole took him to the vet and stayed with him until he was fully recovered. Chico became attached to her, and so she brought him home, much to Uncle Peter's dismay. Chico only trusts my aunt and will always stay by her side and protect her at all costs. Anyway, we arrived at the house early, and Peter called us, telling us they'd be running late because Chico had become ill on the road. My parents, along with Jane and Frank, decided it would be best that we get a drink at the restaurant while waiting for the others to arrive before entering the house. As we ordered something to drink, Jisoo, Dahlia, Ezra, and I pulled out our Nintendos and started playing Mario Kart. Our parents began chatting away with the bartender, talking about our plans for the upcoming week and the villa we would be spending our time in. As the bartender heard in which house we'd be staying in, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Are you folks sure about that? That house is believed to be haunted." Spooked at hearing this, I looked up from my game, falling far behind in the race. "Haunted?" I asked the man with a shaky voice. "Oh yeah, it's been haunted for years. This entire square has been, as a matter of fact. During World War II, the church you see in the middle of the square had been bombed. During the wartime, the folks that lived here decided it'd be best to build tunnels that would lead towards the church. When a warplane would be spotted, everyone would flee into the tunnels and seek shelter underneath the church. Little did they know that the church would fall victim to the bombing and would be coming down on their heads. It's said that almost all the people living on this square were killed. You can still see the damage on the church's roof if you look close enough." "How tragic," my Aunt Jane would mutter. I can still feel the cold shiver that had went down my spine when I heard that story. I'd always been a believer in the paranormal, but I'd never expected to actually visit a real haunted house. I could, however, see the excitement in my niece's eyes. When the other half of the family finally arrived, we went to the house. The house lived up to our expectations. It was grand and beautiful, with a wooden floor that would creak if you walked over it, a large staircase that had a hand railing which was decorated with small iron flowers, and huge chandeliers in every room, which would cast small rainbows on the walls. Jisoo, Dahlia, and I took off in a dash through the house, exploring every room, opening every door, and arguing who was getting which room. The rooms, however, were huge. None of them were particularly small, but some rooms had double beds, while others had bunk beds. Ezra didn't want to share a double bed with me, so we were left with the smallest room at the far end of the hallway, far away from the 2 bathrooms and the staircase that led up to the playroom. Our parents called us downstairs and told us they would be going to the store to buy some food for the coming week, and that Peyton would be in charge while we were gone. He was the eldest, after all. We agreed, and when our parents were gone, we took off in a mad dash up the stairs to the playroom in the attic. Ezra and Peyton started playing on the game consoles, while Jisoo, Dahlia, and Lori started playing ping pong. I went to play with the dollhouse. I was the youngest at the time, and a bit of a weirdo. I didn't always like playing with the others, as they would often ruin the stories I had in my head. So I climbed into the dollhouse and began playing with the dolls that were inside. I was so caught up in the story I was playing, I didn't even notice that the others had gone downstairs. I only really noticed when I heard Peyton and Lori's voices coming from underneath me. At that point, I crawled out of the dollhouse, searching for where the sound was coming from. There behind the dollhouse was a hole in the wood floor. The hole was big enough to fit my hands in, and it gave me a perfect visual of the room Peyton and Lori were in. They were unpacking their stuff. I wanted to shout at them and wave, but I chose not to. I didn't want to scare them. So instead, I went downstairs to unpack my own stuff. That evening, after we'd eaten dinner and watched a movie together, we all decided to go to bed early. We were all exhausted from the 3-hour drive it took to get here. However, that night around 2 a.m., we were awakened by Lori screaming her lungs out. When we all ran to her in Peyton's room, we found Lori crying in Peyton's arms. When Nicole asked what happened, Peyton told their mother that Lori claimed to have seen someone staring at them from a hole in the attic, the hole that I'd found. Lori, trembling, shook her head. "No, I didn't just see someone stare at us, I saw someone reach his or her hand through there." Lori then pointed at the hole in the ceiling with a shaky finger. "I woke up because I heard whispering. When I looked up, I saw someone's hand reaching through the hole." "Peter, Frank, please go look in the attic," Nicole asked politely of the men. My father and Jane went downstairs. That night, we searched the entire house and checked every door, but there was no one, and every door was locked up. It would have been impossible for anyone to get in. Lori and Peyton decided to sleep in the bedroom with their parents, and we all helped move their stuff. The next morning, I decided to go up to the attic to check if there truly was nothing up there. And there was nothing. No sign that someone else had been there. The dollhouse was even just as I'd left it the day before, and every doll still lay where I'd placed them. A little bit spooked, I went downstairs to eat breakfast with the other members of the family. Lori still seemed on edge, her skin as pale as a ghost, and her lips trembling as she ate her breakfast. That morning we went to the beach, and as we were walking on the sandy beach, Jisoo, Lori, Peyton, Ezra, Dahlia, and I started talking about the thing that happened last night. We decided that it would be a smart idea to stay up the coming night to catch the ghost in its act, and Scooby-Doo style reveal that it was just some simple person playing a prank on us. Naive, I know, but we were children back then, and this seemed like the best thing to do. That night we gathered all our snacks and drinks and snuck in the room of Jisoo and Dahlia. Our parents had told us not to stay up too late before heading to bed. We were left alone in the still, dark house while we made ourselves comfortable on the huge bed. The hours crept by while we started to talk about things that happened in our lives, such as the passing of our grandmother and the rift that had grown in our family. I remember feeling happy in that moment. Finally, we were all talking again as we'd done all those years before. We felt like a family once more, happy and close like it always been when Granny was here. Dahlia even started crying, and we hugged her tightly. After this heartwarming conversation, we all grew silent. We were tired. 3 hours had passed and nothing had happened yet. Ezra was growing impatient and eventually grew tired of waiting. He got out of bed and returned to his own room, telling us we could contact him through the Nintendo chat if something was happening, but that he was not going to waste any more time waiting for nothing. We agreed and started the chat up, making sure our chat function was working. Another half hour passed and Peyton and Lori decided to go to bed too, only they didn't offer to stay in touch through the Nintendo. So it was only Jisoo, Dahlia, and I. We crawled underneath the blankets and began to draw things in the Nintendo chat box. We were having a great time. While we were drawing and whispering to each other, we heard the church bell ring 1 a.m. The loud sound of the single bell rang over the square, and a sudden silence fell over the buildings. I even noticed I'd laid my Nintendo down, and I was just holding my breath, listening. Suddenly, we heard the wooden floor above us squeak, as if someone was walking around in the attic. These footsteps sounded slow at first, which made me think it was just the house settling. But as we waited, the footsteps sounded quicker. "Do you guys hear that?" Jisoo asked softly, her voice startling me in the silence. Dahlia and I nodded, our faces only visible through the faint light the Nintendos were giving off. The footsteps continued, and suddenly we heard someone walking around down the stairs of the attic. The stairs were positioned on the other side of the door to the bedroom we were staying in. We held our breath as we listened. Then we could hear someone breathing. It sounded like they were panting, as if in a panic. "One of you send Ezra a message," Jisoo said, and I started typing as fast as I could, but my hands were trembling, and I had trouble holding the pen in my hands. The footsteps and the breathing continued in the hallway, right in front of the door of the bedroom. Dahlia grasped for air when she heard the thing outside the door brush against the door, and Jisoo and I hurriedly covered her mouth. "We need to hide," came the soft, melodic voice from right outside the door, the voice of a young woman. She sounded panicked, but there was a sweetness to her voice that made me forget my fear for a few seconds. But when the unseen person took another step, the fear and adrenaline came back. "We should hide." The voice spoke louder this time. We heard a soft bump against the door as if someone placed their hand on it. I felt a cold wave of fear run down my spine. I waited to hear the door finally open, but the sound never came. The footsteps became more distant, and we could hear someone walking towards the stairs that led to the hallway. "Come on." Jisoo threw the blankets off and jumped out of the bed and towards the door of the bedroom. "We should follow it."
No.
Dahlia exclaimed, her voice muted. She sounded like she was about to cry. "We should stay here, or wake our parents. It could be dangerous." "Oh, come on, Dahlia. You always wanted to be a hero like Totally Spies, didn't you? This is your moment," said Jisoo. And those words did seem to encourage Dahlia. She stepped out of bed, hand in hand with me. Jisoo slowly opened the door, and we walked out of the room into the cold, empty hall. The only sources of light we had were the Nintendos in our hands. We could hear the footsteps downstairs, and a soft sound that was like someone crying. This made the hairs on my arms rise. We snuck down the stairs, then came into another cold hallway. "Hello?" Jisoo asked out loud. The crying then stopped, but we could still hear that breathing. It was coming from the dining room. We held each other tightly as we walked towards the door of the dining room, which we had left open. Suddenly, a dark figure ran past us, out of the dining room and into the kitchen. The sudden movement made us all jump, and Dahlia screamed loudly. We could hear a door being opened, and the footsteps continued into what surely must have been the wine cellar. "Guys, I want to go back," Dahlia said, crying, but Jisoo and I continued walking, too intrigued to stop now. I dragged Dahlia with me while we stepped into the kitchen. The door to the wine cellar was open, and the piercing cold and earthy smell that came from the cellar filled our noses as we approached the door. Jisoo was the first to enter, holding her Nintendo with shaking hands in front of her to lighten our path. The dark was so dense that she tripped down the last 2 steps and slammed her face hard on the ground. As she fell, her Nintendo went flying through the cellar and came to a stop at what should be a closed-off door, but that door was open too. The lock was broken and dangling down on the door. Standing in the now open doorway was a young woman. She was dressed in a flowery, light blue dress, which reached past her knees, and black shoes. She had blonde hair that was neatly tucked into a bun on the back of her head. Her skin was as pale as freshly fallen snow. She looked at us with frightful eyes, and she opened her mouth, saying again, "We should hide." She then turned and hurried down the long, dark tunnel. Dahlia and I quickly helped Jisoo up from the floor, and just as we began to turn towards the open door, all the lights in the house came on. Startled and blinded by the sudden light, we screamed and turned around. Our parents stood there behind us with concerned looks on their faces. They asked what in the world was going on, and we told them everything about the hole in the attic floor, the mysterious sounds, and the woman who led us here, and the open door into the tunnel. But when we turned to face the door in question, the door was closed. The lock was back on it, and there were no traces of that mysterious woman. Only the Nintendo lying on the ground, broken. We were scolded for going into the wine cellar alone, and the rest of the week we were not allowed to be up too late. We also weren't allowed to go anywhere in the house without supervision. The rest of the trip was nice, only every night around 1 a.m. we'd hear the whispers and the footsteps again, but we never went and followed the ghost like that one night. Who knows what would have happened to us, what we would have seen if we had followed her into that tunnel. Our parents never believed us, even when I recounted the story to them to this day, but I know what happened. I know what we saw. I remember all of what I'm telling you. That villa was haunted. Red Eyes, from Austin M. This story is one that's hard to swallow. It's something that makes me question my sanity every time I think about it, or when I hear something similar that's happened to someone else. I've got many stories pertaining to those woods, some scary, some cool. To give an example, one time I was out in the woods with my brother, who was 13 at the time, and my grandpa. During that adventure, we found an old Native American hunting camp. We also found a pit of really old bones. We all know that Native Americans have a ton of old stories. Now, I feel the need to let you all know I'm part Cherokee myself, and have lineage that goes all the way back to a Chief Collins. So it can be said I hold high regards for these stories. Stories of Bigfoot, the one we do not name, Dogman, etc. Now onto the story at hand. For context, it was the fall of 2015. It was me, 14 years old, my little brother, 13, and my mom. We were heading down a dark forested path after a day of bowling in a nearby town. It was an unpaved dirt road and only had one light pole. This one light pole was old and eerie, casting only enough yellow light to go 10 feet in every direction. This pole was also a good 20 feet tall. However, it was 15 feet tall compared to the road, because the road was about 5 feet above the ground where the pole had been planted. Either way, this is all important for what I'm about to tell you. When we saw the light pole in the distance, we were so happy because we knew home was close. However, as we got closer, something didn't feel right. In that instant, all of us felt as if something oppressive was in the area with us. It was so thick that my mom stopped the car. When the car came to a full stop, we were about 40 feet from the circle of light. We also noticed something that we didn't notice before. 2 flaming and burning red eyes. These eyes were only slightly above the light pole. Now you'd think we'd get a good look at what was attached to those eyes. However, we could only see the faintest outline of what seemed to be the largest man I've ever seen. The figure was just barely in the light. I've never felt so helpless before or since. This thing looked like it could just peel the roof right off the car. It felt as if we spent hours looking at this thing. We watched its eyes shifting to look at us one at a time. Let me tell you, I was horrified when this thing looked me dead in the eyes. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my eyes beginning to fill with tears. I wanted nothing more than to look away, yet my eyes wouldn't move. It was like a primal fear took over me, telling me that I would die if I even blinked. So I didn't. Eventually, the creature blinked, then cleared the road in just 2 steps. On the last step, it stepped down the 5-foot embankment with no trouble. After that, it just stood on the side of the road. We took that as an invitation to get the heck out of there before it changed its mind. With that, my mom sped the heck out of there. I can say that I didn't sleep well that night. I would usually keep my blinds open at night to allow me to see the stars, but for the first time in a long time, I shut them. I could not sleep without the fear of thinking I would wake up to those horrific red eyes. In the morning, my little brother and I felt brave enough to go look in the area for tracks, but we couldn't find anything. We saw nothing but turkey, raccoon, deer, and other normal woodland creature tracks. Usually I felt safe in those woods. I would go on early morning runs. I would stay out in the woods well into the night without fear. Now I can no longer go into any woods without bringing a pistol or rifle with me. I don't know if it was a dogman or the thing that shall not be named. I just can't bring myself to think about that night. I can't get past those red eyes without thinking back to that moment in which I thought I was going to die. My family never talked about it after that night for fear it would come back and not spare us again. My people fear that if we talk about something like that, it might come back and not be so nice. I'm 19 now and in college, and I vow to never go back to that specific area of woods again, even if I was offered $1 million and given access to all the nukes in the world to defend myself with. Stories of a Package Courier from Gabe9891. I am a delivery courier for one of the major delivery companies in the U.S. I work around the North Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee bordering areas. I don't have a set route, so sometimes I end up working in very rural and remote areas of the mountains. Here are a couple of my weirdest stories. Number 1. Since the beginning of the whole Rona issue, we had been very busy and heavy due to the increase of online ordering and other factors, such as increases in doctors, pharmacies, and businesses ordering medicines and test kits, etc. We often ended up working past sunset in these particular areas. On one such occasion, I was very tired, aggravated, ready to call it a day at around 8 p.m. It was pitch black at this time. My helper was also tired and ready to go home. I'd made my last delivery for the day, and I was heading back to our station. We were leaving a dirt road and turning onto a main 2-lane 2-way state road when my helper suddenly screamed. This terrified me into hitting the brakes. I hadn't noticed the loud noise of an old engine speeding around a blind curve and about to collide with us on the main road. We both saw the bright headlights from the right side as they came around the curve at tremendous speed, and hardly had a second to react. I hit the brakes as I gripped the steering wheel as hard as I could and turned away from the side that was about to get destroyed, eyes tightly shut. I heard the squealing of the other car's tires. Then, nothing. Not a sound. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes only to find my truck in the middle of the state road, untouched. The other car was nowhere in sight. If it had been able to avoid us, which was impossible due to the speed at which it was traveling, and the fact that there was no way around my truck it could have rationally used, I would have been able to see its taillights or something. But there was nothing. There was simply nowhere it could have gone without making a sound. No way for it to pass unseen by at least one of us. My partner and I were shaking. We didn't tell anyone, but we still avoid that part of the road when we have to be out there. Number 2. This one isn't as haunting as it is disturbing. I found myself once again out in the middle of nowhere. Coming down a dirt road on the side of a mountain, my partner and I saw what looked to be a big black hairball or tumbleweed fall onto the road from the side of the mountain. It must have been about a meter in diameter. I slowed my truck down as a precaution. As we approached this thing, it became clear it was moving, not like rolling around, but like a hive would. It was just buzzing with movement. That's the best way I could describe it. As we were only a few yards from it, the horrible thing burst, kind of like a balloon, onto the dirt and immediately began to scatter. My first reaction was to gun the engine, spin the tires, and hopefully kill whatever the heck was on the road. For days after that, my partner and I kept finding dead, weird-looking spider-like bugs under the truck and in the truck's engine bay. What they were, I don't know. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.